you worked with Ernie Kessler for years.
Oh yeah, Ames Burns Company was founded in Jamestown in 1904.
Oh, is that right?
Nobody knew about it much, but we were the oldest, probably of our type, at one time in the East.
No kidding.
There was somebody maybe a little older in Boston area, but we supplied feed manufacturers their raw materials. Our only customer in Jamestown was Grandin Milling.
Right.
But we covered Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, New England, and into New Jersey mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Why here? Why here of all places?
Well, for one thing, New York State at one time was the largest dairying state in the country.
Mm-hmm.
We're third now after Wisconsin and California.
Right.
We had offices in Jamestown, was the headquarters, and we had an office near Syracuse,
mm-hmm.
Reading, Pennsylvania. Howard Chadwick was with us out in Ohio,
right.
And in Albany.
Mm-hmm.
The company is nothing compared with what it used to be now.
Sure. How did Jim Ditzler get involved in it?
Well, my father was with General Mills,
mm-hmm.
and the job opened up in Jamestown. So he came here in about 1920. And of course, George and Ernest, his father.
Right.
My father and myself, Keith Bailey, I don't know if you ever knew him.
Sure.
Keith Bailey, Howard Chadwick. They were here in office. Then we got a fellow from Pillsbury in Buffalo down here by the name of Ken Backrath.
Okay.
But then we had these other offices.
Mm-hmm. When I think of Ernie Kessler, I think of baseball.
Oh, absolutely. He was a great supporter of the Pony League.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We wrote a history not so long ago on the history of the Pony League, and you couldn't help but begin with Ernie Kessler.
Sure.
And Judge Barger.
That's right.
But it seemed like Ernie was the guy that was the...
He was very, very involved in it, I know.
Therefore, was Ames Burns involved in it too? Or...
Not really.
Yeah.
We were all involved in it because of Ernie Kessler, to an extent.
Right.
We went to the games. Matter of fact, I think we bought stock in the ball club.
Mm-hmm.
So.
It's been fun just to track down Ernie Kessler's kind of baseball.
Yeah. He was brought up as a boy over in Conewango Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So where did you live here? Where was home?
My home here? My family lived over in front,
mm-hmm.
Next to Al Ayers.
Okay.
I live now over on Gordon,
right.
Next to Lillian Ney,
Right. Now,
across from Gordy Black.
There you go. How did your paths cross with the Jacksons?
Well, when we first came to Jamestown, we had a little house on Fairmount.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we went to Fairmount School,
right.
the grade school.
Mm-hmm.
My sister became a good friend of Mary Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And Billy and I were kind of friendly enemies. It's over 75 years ago.
That's right.
And it gets a little hazy in my mind, but I know that Delano Roosevelt was the governor of New York State. Mm-hmm. And I believe that was sometime in the late 20s, mm-hmm. as I recall.
That's right.
And that kind of pinpoints it. I remember back of the Jackson home on Fairmount, there was a kind of a wooded area, and the little boys would play there. I think we were probably in the age of somewhere between 7 and 9 years old, mm-hmm. something like that. And I remember one particular interesting thing. Mr. Jackson, of course, was the Democratic power here in this part of the country.
Right.
and he had a party for Governor Roosevelt.
Mhm.
Now this was back during Prohibition time, you know, and Billy and Jimmy and Mary and Jean were in the kitchen, and the drinks were, and I think they were serving cocktails because Billy and I were drinking the dregs out of the little tiny glasses. We didn't know quite what it was, but we knew that it was something that we had to investigate, see?
Mhm.
So we did. And Billy and I were tent mates at Camp Anyasa.
Mhm.
Back in those days, Anyasa was a tent camp and kind of run like it was some touch of military to it. The little boys had to make their beds and line their shoes up, you know, and keep the tent floor clean, and it seems that most of the counselors were college football players.
Mhm.
And we played softball and archery and tennis and canoeing and all that stuff.
Right. Now, tell me about Robert Jackson. Did you guys have any impression at that young?
Well, yes, I remember seeing him riding. When we were out playing, you know, in that wooded area, he'd be horseback riding in our area. But that's about all I saw of him, was, you know, at that time.
Right, right.
And another thing, we used to play, the Goodell home was just above there, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and we used to play football up there in that field, and I remember little Charlie, he was younger than the rest of us by a few years. He was that tough little nut. I remember that.
Was Bill much of an athlete?
Not so much. I don't know if he played football with us or not.
Mm-hmm.
But we were tent mates at Anyasa, and we were probably, maybe 11 or 12. And because the Jacksons left here when he was about 12 or 13, I think, went to Washington,
Mm-hmm.
I believe. So we didn't see anything of him after that. And Billy and I, we were old enough, we were kind of older camper. We left secretly one afternoon, and we followed the streetcar tracks down to Maple Springs, and there was a girls' house party there.
Mm-hmm.
Roy Wagner, the director, caught us down there.
Uh-huh.
He brought us back to camp and gave us a good lecture, and he said, boys, he said, I should dismiss you from camp, but I won't. You've been good campers, but you won't be invited back next year.
Now you mentioned earlier that you were sort of, I think you may have used the term, friendly rivals with Bill Jackson.
Well, it seems to me that he had a little gang and I had a little gang.
Ah.
But it's so distant, I don't remember. We didn't get into any confrontations or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that we weren't always the best buddies at times.
Right. Was Mary, now her age was the same as your
My sisters.
sister?
My sister was about 2 years younger, and I think Mary was too,
Mhm.
2 years younger than Bill.
Was your sister and Mary, did they ride horses together? Do you have any recollection of that?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
We didn't pay much attention to girls in those days.
Well, at age 12, probably not. Today it's different.
Yeah, it is.
When the Jacksons then went to Washington, do you get any sense that when they came back, there was any...
Well, the last time I saw Bill and Mary, Frank Taylor had a party
Mhm.
up in Asheville.
Right.
And that was the last time I saw, that must be 15 years ago anyways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I understand that, I knew Bill died in New York back here a couple of years ago.
Right.
And I understand Mary's dead too.
That's correct. They both died in 1999.
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah.
And the grandkids have been back here.
They've been back, yes. I didn't know any of them.
Did you know Nancy at all?
No. Didn't know. After the Jacksons left, that was almost the end of the relationship.
Right. All right, now let's talk about you. And you graduated from high school here?
High school here.
And then what happened?
Well, after high school, I became a student at Colgate University.
Mm-hmm.
And I completed 3.5 years. And the war came on.
Mm-hmm.
I was a class of 42. And I was down, my college roommate was probably the greatest track athlete we ever had at Colgate. He was a 440 and a 220 man. And back in the war years, back then there were only 2 bowl games. There was the Rose Bowl and the Shrine Bowl game. Mm-hmm. At San Francisco. Because of the Japanese threat, they moved the Shrine Bowl from San Francisco to New Orleans. And they have beside the football game, they have a series of track meets and other stuff. Mm-hmm. And my roommate was invited to run. Mm-hmm. And I had a car, and we had a little money. He had about $100 traveling expenses from the Rose Bowl, or the Shrine Bowl committee.
Right.
And I had about $50, so between the two of us, we had about $150, so we let out, we stayed at fraternity houses all the way to New Orleans.
No kidding.
And I stayed with my fraternity at Tulane, and poor Al Diebold, he was in training, but I'd come back and tell him these lurid stories, Well, he ran his race and won it, and so we left for Florida. And on the way to Florida at Gulfport, the Eastern All-Star team playing in the Shrine Bowl was coached by Andy Kerr, the Colgate University coach.
Right.
So we stopped and had dinner that night with the team. Then we continued on that night, and we drove to Lauderdale.
Okay.
And while in Lauderdale, I had a call from my father. The draft board is looking for you. You better get back. So we were out of money. So what we did, this was kind of interesting. We went to a citrus orchard and talked with this gentleman who owned it, telling him about our fate, and we had to get back because we were going to be inducted into the service, and so he let us pick all the fruit that we fill up the whole rear of the car, and we sold the fruit.
I'll be darned.
To buy gasoline to get back to Jamestown.
So you could be drafted.
That's right. My roommate, Al Diebold, the track man, his father was the president of the Teachers College at Plattsburgh, New York.
Okay.
So I got back, and I think I went to Syracuse and talked with the Navy up there. See, Colgate didn't have a V-12 program then. Mm-hmm. We had no military training at all. And I didn't...
For the tape, what's the V-12 program?
That was a program that the Navy established in colleges. Mm-hmm. And a lot of students joined it, and they became naval officers and Marine officers. And a lot of them trained right there at Colgate. See, Colgate, when I was there, was a small school, 1,000 male students. Mm-hmm. Today, it's about 2,700, and half of them are women.
Right.
So it's still small.
Mm-hmm.
So then I came back and waited for the draft. And a whole busload of us from Jamestown went up to Fort Niagara. And there was a sergeant up there said, oh, college boy. He said, I suppose you want the quartermaster corps or something. And I said, no, I'm here, I'm in the Army. So he said, infantry. And I was infantry the rest of the war. we went from there to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for basic, and then they sent a whole bunch of us after basic to Camp Shelby, Tennessee, to fill in a Kentucky National Guard outfit.
Okay.
And all the kids, young men in my company there, were mountain boys from Logan County and Harlan County, you know. And boy, they looked askance at us. But finally, they were nice kids.
Right.
Marvelous names. I know we had a great hulking guy. It must have been 6'3", a great big mountain boy. Had that marvelous name, Chelsea Lacefield. Well, what happened there, this regiment was supposed to have an inspector general inspection coming up, and they didn't have their 201 files on their soldiers, and they picked out, because I was a college graduate, and another fella, his name was Joseph Smith. They promoted me to corporal and Joseph Smith to sergeant, and we interviewed all of the men in the whole regiment and got their forms up to date. Well, right at the end of it, Joseph Smith was pulled out of Camp Shelby and sent to Dartmouth and made a lieutenant, or a lieutenant commander, what he was. He was a graduate of Harvard and the School of Economics in London. He never told me that until when we left, because I was like, what are you leaving for?
Yeah.
So after that, graduation time at Colgate, I'd had 3.5 years. But I had enough quality points, and I lacked 9 hours, so I went back and graduated with my class. I was a big corporal in the Army.
Yeah.
And they gave me my diploma. I never had to go back and complete because I had good enough marks.
Sure.
And then I went back to Shelby, and then I got to know the colonel of the regiment. He had been either the mayor or the chief of police of Louisville. See, it was a National Guard outfit. And he suggested that I apply for officer's training, so he sent me to Benning, and I became a 13-week wonder, you know. Infantry officer. You know, a young college kid about 21 or 22 years old, you know, being thrust in this world was really something. And my first assignment was Camp Butner, North Carolina. We were the ones who I would establish the 78th Lightning Division. And a fellow that I got to know very well, Dean Short, who was Walter Short, he graduated from West Point the same time I did from Colgate. And we became good friends. Of course, Dean was promoted almost immediately to first lieutenant and then captain, but the rest of us were second lieutenants. You know how it is, West Pointer. But I had some good times with Dean. Then, for some reason, they broke up part of that division, and we took quite a few of them down to Port Everglades, Florida, for shipment to North Africa. That was in the early days of North Africa. And then we went back, and a Ranger Battalion, the 1st Ranger Battalion, was started at Camp Forest, Tullahoma, Tennessee. And a bunch of us, second lieutenants, were sent over there. And we were with the 1st Ranger Battalion. And that lasted probably, I guess, maybe we were with them 3 months. And the idea was they had British commandos come over and teach us certain things like booby traps and hand-to-hand combat and building Nazi villages and all that stuff. Then they broke us up and sent us out over the 2nd Army, teaching the various divisions, and I finally ended up in Fort Meade, Maryland. And it looked like I was training soldiers again, still a second lieutenant. And I met my wife when I was at Camp Butner. And we decided, it looked like I was going to be in Fort Meade for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided to get married. So her family and a lot of people from Jamestown, Ernie Kessler, and a lot of them came down. There was a man in Jamestown who was a friend of my father by the name of Harold Buck. And Harold Buck, back a few years before the war, went to Washington and became a kind of a promoter for various inventors. He sold self-sealing gasoline tanks to naval aircraft and became very wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And he arranged the whole wedding for us.
I'll be there.
And he had a suite of rooms in the Hay Adams house, and my bride and I, we stayed there. And 3 days later, I reported back to Meade. I had a short leave, and I had overseas orders.
Surprise, surprise. Huh?
So I went back and told Rachel that what happened. So I left Meade, and we sent us to Camp Shanks. That was the embarkation in New York City. Mm-hmm. She went back to Raleigh, to North Carolina. And I ended up on this very small troop transport. I think there were probably about 200 men and about 15 officers. And we were supposed to go to North Africa, but our orders were changed. We ended up in Panama. And we were in Panama for probably a month taking jungle training. And lo and behold, we didn't go to North Africa. We went to the South Pacific. And
by the way, what was your impression going through the Panama Canal?
well, that was quite an experience, you know.
Right.
Just fantastic to see. And we didn't see too much of it because they had us out in the jungle.
Mm-hmm.
And that was I wouldn't want to go through that month again.
Right, right.
So then we finally left and we ended up in New Caledonia.
Oh, wow.
And I was being interviewed to be sent north to probably to one of the divisions. See, this headquarters was a split headquarters, I found out. Admiral Halsey was the Navy commander, and Lieutenant General Millard Harmon, Air Corps General. It was before the Air Force was established. He was of the Jimmy Doolittle spats type, you know.
Right.
It was a split headquarters. And from this headquarters, Guadalcanal and the other battles of the Solomons were fought. Mm-hmm. It was a tent headquarters. And I was interviewed by this major, and he said, Ditzler, he said, did you know so-and-so? And I said, sure, he was a friend of mine at Colgate. He said, I'm his brother. He said, how would you like a nice job? And of course, if anybody said that, you'd say, no thanks. The major said, no, I'm not kidding, but the commanding general of the theater wants a college graduate and a line officer to train the men in his headquarters. And I said, General MacArthur? And he said, no. He said, General MacArthur is Southwest Pacific in Brisbane. This is Lieutenant General Harmon. So I went down and looked at it. What had happened, they brought this headquarters together with a lot of college professors and highly trained people. They had no military training.
Right.
And what I did, I trained them. And I was promoted immediately to first lieutenant. Now, I was there for quite a few months. Mm-hmm. It was like living in paradise, really. Here I was probably as well trained as any young second lieutenant, you know, civilian second lieutenant. But I ended up in this very plush situation. Mm-hmm. I had about 200 men this was the detachment of the headquarters company. The headquarters company was that supplied and did all the services for the headquarters. See, and I was the detachment commander, and under me were the men who worked in. I was like a super landlord, sort of, see. But I did a lot of training, taught them how to march, how to shoot, and all this stuff. And in the company we had Zane Gray's marlin that he used to fish off the Barrier Reef in New Caledonia and in Australia. And New Caledonia is the largest French possession in the Pacific. It's an island about 275 miles long with a mountain range in between. Very interesting. It was the original Devil's Island before they moved to the coast of South America. While there, we had a dentist in our company who opened up a little clinic and was taking care of the French kids. Well, because of that, a family invited him to go and visit their grandfather's island called Eelwyn and bring a friend. So this island was probably about, maybe 30 miles off the coast of New Caledonia. And we took the marlin over, and I spent 5 days on this. It was a coconut plantation. You can't believe it. And I became very good friends with the family. Their name was, well, they say Pet, we pronounce it Petrie. He was with the French government there. And I spent 5 days there, the captain there, who was the dentist, and I had the Navy pick us up in a PT boat. And we went back to New Caledonia. Back in 1960...
Just stop for a second, because it was a French possession. Where did they stand with regards to the Nazis? You know, the Germans had...
Well, they were Vichy at first, see? But then they were overthrown, and New Caledonia became the biggest staging area for American divisions going north in the early days of the Solomons. That's where they trained, and some of them came back there for recreation and rest too later.
So your buddy Petrie, was he a Vichy originally?
No, I don't think so. He had a little daughter, Yannick. I'll never forget her. She was a little kid, and I carried her all over the island on my shoulders. You know, I got pictures of her. And in 1960, my wife and I went back and visited them. Had a great time, but I've lost track with them. They went back to Paris. She was going to study to become an English teacher, and she went to the Sorbonne. And after they left, I lost track of them. As a matter of fact, when we were in New Zealand, I wrote to them and tried to find them because I wanted to go from New Zealand up to New Caledonia and see them again. This was back about 7 or 8 years ago.
Right.
Well, what happened, General Harmon, when the war moved north, he left us. Instead of being a tactical headquarters, we turned into a supply headquarters. We had a Major General by the name of Galbraith come in and take over, and we lost it. He built a big Pentagon building and little houses for us, you know. And I'm not quite sure of this, but General Harmon was supposed to go north and assume command of the B-29s. And his whole staff was lost. They never found him, and that's when Curtis LeMay came in and command. That story's a little hazy in my mind, but I think that's what happened.
Right.
Well, after a while, when we left there, a group of us left. We were sent up to the Philippines, and we stopped briefly in Hollandia, New Guinea. We weren't there very long. Then we continued on to the Philippines. We went in through the Lingayen Gulf. The fighting had about finished, though, in the Philippines, and we had an encampment. They turned us kind of into military government, what we were. And so we were in the Philippines for some time, and I remember going up to Baguio, and the war ended. The atomic bombs came down. I saw Hiroshima from a distance.
Really?
I'll never forget that.
Well, explain that.
Well, just mass devastation. You couldn't believe it. And I had he was a linguist. It was a Japanese. He was my interpreter. And he took me to his village one time, and I'm telling you, we'd go up through the areas in Japan, and farmers' barns were shot full of 50 caliber machine guns. The Navy just laid off, they shot everything that moved in Japan. When we landed at a place called Wakayama. It was about probably 35 miles down a little peninsula from Colby. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of we were a small company at the time. And a military government in this little town of the small city of Wakayama. And we were there. And of course I had enough points to go home, but they said I was essential and I had to go on occupation duty. Of course I hated it. My wife joined the Red Cross, and she was in Europe with the Red Cross, and she was going to return, and of course here I was in Japan. And as I look back at it, I thought it was a marvelous experience. Mm-hmm. You couldn't believe the devastation in Japan and how they pulled out of it. Right. When we arrived, I think we went ashore with armor, infantry and armor. We didn't see any Japanese for 3 days. Then we started seeing little faces appearing. And we had a lot of equipment piled up on the beaches, I remember, and I took my first sergeant, and we went down one night to take them coffee and something to eat, because we had guards. And it must have been midnight, and I was standing there talking with some of the guys, and out of the gloom crawled this Japanese woman and a baby, starving to death. But she was so hungry that she came into this circle, and we fed her. Right. And she thanked us and left. And I said to some of the soldiers there that night, supposing it had been an American woman calling into a Japanese encampment, right, do you think she would have gotten the same treatment? Right.
How long were you in Japan?
We arrived about the same time that MacArthur did in August, and I left in March, I think.
Oh, really?
Went up to Nagoya, went to Seattle. I remember when we got Seattle, the U.S. had a boat full of dancing girls. And the soldiers, I'm almost going to turn the boat over. And we went into the officers' mess, and we had a marvelous steak meal. And all of the waiters and everything were German POWs. And then we took the troop train, and we ended up in, we got out in South Dakota someplace, and there was a train wreck ahead of us. We had a whole bunch of soldiers on this thing. It was in the middle of winter, you know. It was in late March. And we were held up there, and the lady of this little town, I don't remember the name of it, came out and invited us all to the high school, had a big meal for us and a dance in South Dakota. Finally, we went back to I can't think of the camp, it's outside of Indianapolis. And I decided, I'd been promoted to captain. It hadn't come through officially yet. I decided that this was the end of my life, and there probably were about 50 or 60 officers on this train. And there were 2 of us that refused commissions. Of course, they put us right at the end, and my captaincy never came through because of it. I had when I was in Japan, the company commander left, and so I took command of the company. as a first lieutenant. And a general came and inspected us and liked what he saw, the camp we had. And he asked me, he said, I need an aide. He said, are you interested? And I said, what does that entail, sir? And he said, I'd promote you to lieutenant colonel. And he said, I'd be sure you got a regular Army commission. And I said, what would that entitle me to? And he said, first lieutenant. But I refused it. I wanted to go home. Sure. So we got home, and
by the way, you mentioned points. I've heard all the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials talk about points that they were accumulating.
We accumulated points for the time overseas. Mm-hmm. If you were in combat, you got more points, and if you got so many points, then you could leave. See, come back to the States.
You kept track of those? I mean, everybody kind of knew what.
Oh, you bet. I was gone about 30 months total.
Just as an aside, several of the prosecutors who were with Jackson at Nuremberg, as soon as they got done with their part of the program, if they had enough points, they were gone. They were absolutely gone. It was
that's what we had.
Yeah, they were keeping track too.
Yeah. Oh, we watched those points.
Jim, could I interrupt and ask you a question about the occupation of Japan? Were you responsible for feeding the people as well, or what?
Well, we fed them. We weren't responsible for it, Raleigh, but we did feed them because they didn't have any food, and we had, under MacArthur, we had a very benevolent occupation. And that was one of the reasons that Japan today is still one of our strong allies. As much as they forced our automobile manufacturers and so forth to improve cars and everything, right. they've been a staunch ally of ours. The Japanese, the little bit I know of them, have two sides. They can be very nice and very gracious. Boy, they can be arrogant and tough too. Right. They've mellowed, though. They're not like they used to be. They're a lot different than they were.
Then you come back, catch up. How do you catch up with Rachel?
Well, she got back about a week before I did. Mm-hmm. She was with the Red Cross, and her first job was they were serving the 8th Air Force, north of London, where the B-17s and the 25s were doing daylight bombing, and she worked with them, and she stayed with a family up in a little town north of London, and the family name was Christie, and Mr. Christie wouldn't admit there were any Americans over there. Yeah. He was a Scot, but he was a real, and when the American flights would go out and they were sitting in the kitchen with them and the coffee cups and the teacups would rattle, and Mr. Christie would say, he said, girls, he said, the Lanks and the Halifaxes are out again today.
During the time you were in the service, what was the most significant moment you recall?
Well, I think the most significant moment probably was when you discovered, one of them, that you were a soldier. Right. You were going into an entirely different life, Instead of being a carefree college boy, here you're going into a period of discipline, into an entirely different world, one that you never knew about.
Did a lot of college students have a hard time with that?
I think some did. I knew quite a few flunked out of officers' training school at Benning.
Right.
Quite a few. But anyone who went through World War II and survived it and wasn't wounded in return, basically had a great experience. No question about it. And the thing about it was that the whole country was behind you, see? It wasn't like Vietnam where these poor kids came back, to emptiness in many ways.
Right, right.
So it was a different feeling entirely. But of course, one of my biggest challenges after being married for 3 days and being away for 30 months was to get to know my wife again.
Oh, sure.
So,
Think about it.
so I had about 90 days terminal leave coming, and we drove across the country. This was back in the days, and before superhighways. And I remember we went to New Orleans, and from New Orleans we went out through Albuquerque and visited her family were Navy people. Her father was an architect and a civil engineer in Raleigh, but she had an uncle who was an admiral in the Navy and stationed in San Diego, so we went down to see them. And then wandered back across the country, and I was thinking of applying for Harvard Business School, but I went to Boston. I couldn't find a place to live. So I gave that up. And Ernie Kessler wanted me to come with the company.
Right.
See, so I did. My father was a little opposed. He didn't know if he wanted me to, but it worked out fine.
What was the biggest adjustment in getting back with your wife again? I mean,
Well, get to know one another, really,
Yeah.
We wrote back and forth. We had letters back and forth. Sometimes the letters would arrive in batches of 20 at a time, But we kept correspondence pretty well.
Can't even imagine that.
Yeah.
Did you? Really?
I'm kind of amused that the situation of our soldiers today, they're away 10 months, is terrible. Some of these British soldiers were away for 5 years,
Right.
in North Africa. And a lot of American soldiers were away for 2-3 years, So.
What was the impression that the soldiers had of Roosevelt?
Well, this is interesting. When I was in New Caledonia, I had a big first sergeant. His name was, no, he wasn't the first sergeant. He was the company clerk. Zappelli was his name. And he came into my office, my orderly room, tears streaming down his face. And I said, "What's the matter?" He was a corporal. And he said, "President Roosevelt died." Of course, I was brought up in a Republican family, so that didn't break my heart, really, But a lot of the soldiers felt it. Really, he was much admired.
Right. We had a movie we showed at Chautauqua last summer, his I Hate War speech, and we had several folks talk about the soldiers would recite that I hate war, Eleanor hates war, the dog hates war, we hate war, The soldiers had a kind of a derisive tone in that. Did you follow at all, once you got back from the war crimes trials?
Well, I knew about it, yes, and I knew about Justice Jackson, see? But that was all I did. I didn't do anything or talk with anybody about it.
Right.
But I was interested, naturally. I think everybody was.
Then you come back to Jamestown. And
Came back to Jamestown, went with Ames Burns, and I was with them 40 years, and when they ended, I was president. And I retired in '85 and sold all my stock because I've been the kind of a person, once I know something is ended, a new life, I don't want to cling to the other.
Right.
They wanted me to stay on as a consultant,
Do you have a hobby now?
I play a lot of golf, play some tennis, I garden, I read a lot. I travel a lot. My wife and I have been almost every place in the world.
Right.
When you get 84 years old, though, you don't do quite the things you used to do.
Mm-hmm. You're way out.
Yeah.
Very, very,
So,
don't look at it all. It's quite remarkable.
well, thank you.
What's the highlight of Jim Ditzler's career?
Well, I think my Army service was one of the highlights.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, my business, I was quite a substantial producer
Mm-hmm.
in my company, and I had a good income.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that being married to a very fine gal
Mm-hmm.
is a big plus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, lots of I've never been a joiner. Now, when I was younger, I was a joiner.
Right.
I was president of the Brockhattie clan. You know, that's the one that Stan Weeks started. You know, here in the high school, I was president of that, and I was in a lot of things. I used to hunt and fish back in those days. I haven't hunted, haven't fished since the Army or anything, see? But I play golf and I travel a lot and play some tennis and have a lot of friends.
That's terrific.
Never joined a service club. When, this is kind of interesting. My father was a Lion. I think he was district governor at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And because I traveled, the service clubs all wanted me to show my slides, see?
Right.
It's for their entertainment. I did that for a number of times. But you know, when I remember the Lions Club with the tail twister and everything, by the time they get through with all their meetings and everything, for you to do your program, half of them have left.
Right.
But I decided to put my effort into my business and so forth. And I know lots of times, a lot of my friends, they'd play cards at noon, but I would go down to the deli and buy a sandwich or something and an apple and come back and read the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
Because it was quiet then.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never been much of a joiner in anything.
Do you have family in Jamestown, Jim?
No, they're all gone.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had a sister, and she and her husband lived in Skinny Atlas.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both dead.
Right.
And they've got 3 nice kids. One's in San Diego, and one's in Syracuse, and one's in Casanova.
What's left for you to do?
I don't want to get morbid.
I mean, you're a vivacious guy. You've done a lot, and you're not going to slow down much. I mean, I realize.
Well, I'm not going. I hope not. We're going to Arizona this year again,
Right.
and I'd like to take another overseas trip.
Mm-hmm.
We've always traveled independently. I saw Peter up at the club the other day, Raleigh, and he had a tie on and showing his animal tie, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that you, the 4 of you, took a very nice trip in Africa.
Right. You rented a car and did it ourselves.
Yeah, we did too. We were in Africa for 7 weeks, traveling independently.
Right.
And but the last 2 or 3 trips we've taken have been elder hostels.
Mm-hmm.
We took 2 to Italy, 1 to the north and 1 to the south. And 2 years ago, we took a marvelous elder hostel to Chile and Argentina.
Over there.
And that's a nice way to do when you get older, you know.
Right.
They take care of you. You don't have to carry your luggage and book your rooms. Because we always traveled without reservations. You know, we just potluck.
What fun.
Yeah. We took a marvelous trip through Australia back about 4 years ago. No reservations. We got over to Sydney and we went in to see the airline over there, Ansett, and they arranged everything for us. The only thing they couldn't do was to arrange New Guinea. We wanted to go to New Guinea. So when we were in Cairns, we arranged with the Air New Guinea to fly into New Guinea, and we went to Tari up in the Highlands, and there's a marvelous lodge up there. And we were there for about 3 or 4 days. And then we went down to one on the Sepik River, another lodge. So we got the Highlands and we got the lowlands.
Right, right.
And interesting, we flew, well, they look like these Canadian bush pilot planes, you know. One pilot, usually a young Australian, and we'd land in these, you fly over this vast jungle, you know, as you look down at New Guinea. If you ever went down there, nobody ever find you. And most of the travel in Papua New Guinea is either by air or by water, the rivers. Very few roads. And it's still wild, wild country. That was the fun. And we had one of the Hemingway girls with us on this trip. We were traveling independently. We went to this lodge up in the Highlands, and they had an Australian young man running it. And I said, "Okay, I'm here. Where's the golf course?" But there wasn't any. I don't think they have a golf course in New Guinea. They might.
Port
Moresby may have one. Yeah.
This is terrific. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, Joe.